A black elderly man was humiliated in a bank. Luckily, people were not indifferent. Some stories start in the most ordinary places on an ordinary day and end up revealing the truest sides of human nature, which is exactly what happened. The evening air outside was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked pavement as pedestrians hurried along the sidewalk, their coats pulled tight against the chill. Inside Jacob's Grill, the warmth of dim lighting and the hum of quiet conversation created a comforting contrast to the world beyond its doors. The restaurant had been around for decades, its wooden tables bearing the marks of time, and framed black and white photographs of Portland's past hanging on the walls. The scent of grilled steak and freshly baked bread filled the air, mixing with the soft clinking of silverware against porcelain plates. Michael Henderson sat at one of the smaller tables near the back, where the light was slightly dimmer, offering a sense of privacy. His fingers, slightly unsteady, moved through the worn bills in his wallet. He had ordered a modest meal, nothing extravagant, a bowl of soup, a sandwich, and a cup of coffee. But as he looked at the check, his stomach tightened. The total was more than he had expected. Taxes, service charges, small additions that, together, made a difference. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple before glancing at the cash in his hand. It wasn't enough. The realization settled over him like a weight. He had always been careful with his expenses, but things had changed lately. He hesitated, his pride battling with practicality, before finally raising a hand to call over the waitress. Tina, a young woman in her early 20s, approached with a tired but polite smile. She had been working here for a while, balancing shifts with college classes, and she recognized Michael as a regular. He spoke in a quiet tone, gesturing slightly toward the check, his explanation laced with embarrassment. She listened, nodding occasionally, then excused herself, heading toward the register. At the table beside him, a man in a tailored charcoal suit casually sipped a glass of red wine. Walter Bailey had noticed Michael the moment he walked in. The way he hesitated at the door, the way he counted his bills twice, small details that told a larger story. Walter had spent years in finance. He understood the silent weight of financial struggle. He had seen people lose homes, savings, dignity. Now, as Michael sat in quiet discomfort, Walter tapped his fingers against the stem of his glass. The scent of oak and dark berries lingered as he took another slow sip, then set the glass down. His gaze lingered on the older man, studying him with a detached curiosity before he leaned slightly forward. Michael hesitated before answering. He wasn't used to discussing his problems with strangers, especially ones who radiated the kind of effortless confidence Walter did. But there was something in the question, perhaps the way it was asked so casually, as if it were a simple matter of numbers and policy, that struck a nerve. He explained, his voice steady but subdued. His pension had been reduced unexpectedly. The bank had withdrawn additional fees, small amounts that added up over time. He had tried to dispute it, but the responses had been vague, unhelpful. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls led to automated menus. Walter listened, then exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. His expression held no sympathy, only amusement. He knew how banks operated. Of course he did. It was all in the fine print, tucked away where most people wouldn't think to look. Adjustments, new policies, revised terms. Always legal, rarely fair. He shrugged, making a brief remark about responsibility, about how people should read what they sign. Michael said nothing. His fingers curled slightly against the table, but his expression remained still. The noise of the restaurant seemed distant now. A waiter passed by. Laughter rose from another table, but in the space between them, there was only silence. Walter finished his wine, glanced at his watch, and stood. He adjusted his cufflinks, gave a polite nod, and walked toward the exit, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive cologne. Michael watched him go, then lowered his gaze back to the check. He reached into his wallet again, counting once more, as if the numbers might have changed. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp pavement and fallen leaves as Michael made his way toward the nearest branch of Organ Bank. The city was waking up around him. Cars idled at stoplights, coffee shops bustled with early customers, and pedestrians moved with quiet purpose. He pulled his coat tighter against the morning chill, his breath visible in the air. The bank occupied a corner lot, its glass facade reflecting the gray sky. Inside, the familiar hum of business filled the space. Keyboards clicking, low murmurs of conversations, the occasional rustle of paperwork. Customers stood in line at the teller's desks, while others sat in chairs near the loan department, waiting for their turn. The scent of freshly printed documents and faint traces of cologne mixed with the sterile aroma of polished surfaces. At the customer service desk stood Judy Hall, a mid-level manager in her late 40s. She adjusted her reading glasses and glanced up from her monitor, her gaze landing on Michael as he stepped forward. She recognized him immediately. He had been here a few weeks ago with the same concerns, only to leave with vague reassurances and no real answers. Michael remained calm as he explained his issue again. His pension had been reduced due to unexpected deductions, and he wanted to understand the exact reason. He had received no prior notice, no warnings, just smaller deposits and unhelpful automated responses when he tried to inquire. His tone was steady, but there was a quiet insistence beneath it, a refusal to be dismissed so easily this time. Judy sighed, her fingers moving over the keyboard as she navigated his account details. The screen glowed in front of her, displaying columns of numbers, transaction dates, policy changes. Without looking up, she recited the standard explanation, that all deductions aligned with the bank's updated terms and conditions, which customers were responsible for reviewing. Her voice was even, but there was an edge of impatience, the kind that came from repeating the same script too many times. Michael didn't react right away. Instead, he asked to see the exact documentation outlining these deductions. Not a summary, not a verbal confirmation. He wanted the written proof. Judy hesitated. Her fingers tapped against the desk before she scrolled further, searching through the system for the relevant section. A moment later, she found it, a record of policy changes that had resulted in increased service fees. But as her eyes skimmed the details, something caught her attention. The effective date of these changes didn't align with the deductions. The fees had been applied retroactively, pulled from accounts before the policy had officially taken effect. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She quickly masked it, but Michael noticed. His eyes, sharp with experience, caught the brief pause, the almost imperceptible tension in her posture. He leaned slightly forward, waiting. Before Judy could formulate a response, the glass door of a nearby office swung open. John Malone, the regional manager, stepped into the main floor. Tall, confident, and always impeccably dressed, he carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions without question. His gaze swept the room before settling on Judy and Michael. Noticing the shift in atmosphere, he approached the desk, his polished shoes barely making a sound on the tile floor. He glanced at the monitor, then at Judy, silently demanding an explanation. She hesitated before summarizing the situation. Michael's complaint, the deductions, the policy discrepancy. John absorbed the information with practiced indifference before shifting his focus to Michael. His response was immediate and unwavering. The bank operated within legal boundaries, he stated plainly. Customers were responsible for reviewing account terms. Policy changes were standard practice. And if Michael had an issue, he was free to submit a formal inquiry through the proper channels. The finality in his tone was clear. The matter, as far as he was concerned, was settled. Michael felt the weight of familiar frustration settle over him. He had seen this tactic before. Polite dismissal wrapped in professional language. A wall of bureaucracy designed to exhaust rather than assist. He glanced once more at Judy, who had already averted her gaze, then back at Malone, whose posture remained relaxed, confident. A quiet realization took shape in Michael's mind. They had no intention of addressing his concerns. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an oversight. It was deliberate. And if he walked away now, nothing would change. Michael spent the rest of the afternoon lost in thought. The realization that the bank had intentionally imposed retroactive fees gnawed at him. He needed to find out if others had been affected or if this was an isolated case. If it was deliberate, then it had to be happening to more people. The next morning, he walked to the city library, a modest brick building that had stood for decades. Inside, the scent of old books and polished wood filled the air, muffling the sounds of the outside world. Behind the front desk sat Sarah Bishop, an old friend and a longtime librarian. She had always been sharp, energetic despite her age, and had a deep distrust of large institutions. Michael explained his situation, and Sarah led him to a quiet corner where a row of computers stood beneath tall bookshelves. She guided him through the process of searching public financial records, banking regulations, and recent policy changes. He scrolled through documents, scanning legal jargon that seemed intentionally convoluted. Sarah pointed out that major banking policy changes typically require direct customer notification, letters, emails, or, at the very least, online announcements. Michael frowned. He had received nothing. No warnings, no paperwork, no emails. The fees had simply appeared, reducing his pension without explanation. Determined, he left the library and began asking around his neighborhood. He spoke to elderly residents in his apartment complex, to people waiting at the bus stop, to acquaintances he ran into at the grocery store. Many of them were longtime customers of Oregon Bank, and as he listened, a pattern emerged. Several pensioners had noticed smaller deposits, unexplained fees, or sudden changes in their accounts. Some had tried to complain but had been dismissed with vague explanations. Others had assumed it was a mistake on their part or had given up after dealing with endless automated responses. Most were frustrated but had no idea where to turn. Michael took notes, writing down names, amounts, and details. Each story reinforced his suspicions. This wasn't an accident. The bank had deliberately targeted vulnerable customers, knowing they were unlikely to fight back. Days passed and Michael's frustration grew. He needed to act, to force people to pay attention. He wasn't a lawyer or a journalist, but he could at least make noise. One crisp morning, he arrived in front of the Oregon Bank branch, carrying a hand-painted sign. The message was simple: return our money. He stood near the entrance, his breath visible in the cool air, gripping the sign with steady hands. Customers came and went, barely sparing him a glance. Employees inside pretended not to see him. For the first hour, nothing happened. Then an older woman slowed her pace as she passed. She stopped, read the sign, and nodded. A man in a faded jacket hesitated before approaching, curiosity in his eyes. Soon another person joined them, then another. People began talking, sharing their experiences. Some were hesitant, unsure if protesting would change anything. Others were angrier, their voices rising as they recounted how the bank had drained their accounts with hidden fees. A small crowd had formed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Within hours, a call from a local television station reached the bank. A reporter had heard about the small protest outside and wanted to comment. The bank's management had no choice but to respond. John Malone stepped outside, his expression carefully composed. The regional manager projected an air of calm authority as he faced the growing crowd. With a measured tone, he dismissed the accusations, insisting that any issues with fees were minor and easily resolved. He assured everyone that the bank took customer concerns seriously and would conduct an internal review. Michael stood among the onlookers, arms crossed, watching Malone's performance. He didn't believe a word of it. The statement was designed to pacify the public without making any real commitments. The next morning, a call came from the bank, summoning Michael for a private discussion. He arrived at the branch and was led into a polished office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Seated behind a sleek wooden desk was Walter Bailey, the same man Michael had encountered in the restaurant. Bailey welcomed him with a practiced smile, gesturing for him to take a seat. He spoke in a smooth, measured tone, acknowledging that the bank understood Michael's frustrations. He assured him that the institution wanted to make things right. The bank was willing to refund the fees deducted from Michael's account. However, there was a condition: the protest needed to stop. Michael listened without reacting. Bailey explained that unnecessary attention could damage the bank's reputation. He insisted that the situation had been exaggerated and that Michael had made his point. Now it was time to let the professionals handle it. Michael leaned forward and asked the only question that mattered: would the bank return the money to everyone affected? The air in the room changed. Bailey's smile faded, replaced by a cooler, more calculating expression. He told Michael that pushing further would not be in his best interest. He spoke carefully, avoiding direct threats, but the implication was clear. If Michael continued stirring unrest, things could become difficult for him. Michael met Bailey's gaze, unflinching. Then, without another word, he stood up and walked out of the office. As he stepped outside into the crisp morning air, his decision was made. The bank wanted him to back down. That meant he was finally getting somewhere, and he had no intention of stopping now. Sarah worked quickly, using her connections to set up a meeting with local journalists. That afternoon, Michael found himself sitting across from a reporter in the quiet back room of the library. The journalist, a sharp-eyed woman named Emily Carter, listened intently as Michael explained how pensioners and low-income clients had been subjected to hidden fees. He presented copies of bank statements showing the unexplained deductions and shared stories from others who had experienced the same issue. Emily took notes, occasionally glancing up at Michael as he spoke. She had covered financial scandals before, but something about this case struck her. The people affected were among the most vulnerable, and the bank's dismissive response made it all the more alarming. She promised to run the story. That evening, the segment aired on the local news. The footage showed interviews with frustrated customers, including a retired teacher who had lost nearly a month's worth of grocery money to the unexplained fees. Experts weighed in, criticizing the bank's lack of transparency. The piece ended with a shot of Michael standing outside the bank, holding a sign demanding accountability. The response was immediate. By the next afternoon, a crowd had gathered outside the bank. What had started as a small protest now included dozens of people, elderly customers, young activists, and concerned citizens. Some carried handmade signs while others chanted, demanding answers. The street in front of the bank buzzed with energy. Inside, John Malone watched the situation unfold through the tinted windows of his office. His phone rang constantly. Calls from upper management, legal teams, and public relations specialists. He had underestimated Michael. The story had gained traction, and now the bank was facing real scrutiny. Frustrated, Malone ordered additional security to monitor the entrance. However, the protesters remained peaceful. The bank had no legal grounds to force them to disperse. The police watched from a distance, but there was no justification for intervention. Meanwhile, deep within the bank, a young financial analyst named Thomas Clark sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. He had joined the company with the hope of building a career in finance, but the past few months had left him disillusioned. He had seen the documents, the internal memos that detailed how the bank had deliberately altered fee structures without notifying regulators. He knew that what they had done was illegal. Thomas hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. He glanced around the office. His colleagues worked as if nothing was wrong, as if the protests outside was just another minor inconvenience. He exhaled slowly, then opened an encrypted email account. That evening, an anonymous message landed in the inbox of several journalists, including Emily Carter. Attached were scanned documents, internal emails, meeting transcripts, and financial reports. The evidence was clear. The bank had knowingly implemented illegal fee changes, gambling that no one would notice. The storm was about to break. The next morning, the bank became the center of a storm. Representatives from the Federal Financial Oversight Agency arrived at the branch, their presence calm but authoritative. They conducted a thorough investigation, reviewing documents, interviewing staff, and analyzing the bank's internal records. The findings were damning. The bank's actions had violated financial regulations, manipulating fee structures without proper disclosure or approval. It was clear that this was not an isolated mistake, but a deliberate act. The agency issued a public statement, revealing the scale of the misconduct and announcing that legal proceedings would follow. As the news spread, the fallout for the bank was swift and severe. John Malone and Walter Bailey, unable to escape the inevitable consequences, both resigned in an attempt to avoid further scandal. The press caught wind of their departures, framing it as an admission of guilt. Their sudden exit did little to quell the growing anger among the public. In the weeks that followed, the bank's board of directors appointed new management. The incoming executives, keen to repair the bank's damaged reputation, promised to overhaul the institution's policies and procedures. They announced that customer complaints would be addressed more transparently, and that fees would be restructured in a way that was fairer and more in line with industry standards. The shift in leadership was a start, but for many it felt like too little, too late. Amidst the chaos, Michael received a letter from the bank. It was a formal communication, apologizing for the errors and notifying him that the money he had lost would be refunded. But when he opened the envelope, he discovered that the refund wasn't just the amount he had lost, it was more. The bank had decided to compensate him for the emotional distress caused by the incident, as well as to make amends for the harm done to his fellow customers. For a moment, Michael simply stared at the check. It wasn't just the money that struck him. It was the acknowledgement that his efforts had made a difference. His persistence had caused a ripple, one that had shaken the very foundations of the institution. As he walked past the bank one afternoon, he noticed a young employee standing at the entrance, greeting customers with a genuine smile. It wasn't the practiced, empty expression that had been so common before. This was real human warmth. Michael paused for a moment, watching the young man interact with a couple of elderly customers. Perhaps things were starting to change, even if only a little. He couldn't help but wonder if, in the end, this small victory would lead to a larger transformation. Michael continued on his way, not knowing what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet sense of hope.